In the harsh winter of 1883, deep in the Wind River Valley of Wyoming Territory, a German stonemason named Heinrich Vogel became the subject of relentless mockery from every rancher within 30 miles of his homestead. While his neighbors hurriedly constructed their traditional rectangular log cabins before the first snow, measuring exactly 16 by 20 feet as frontier convention dictated, Vogel spent 7 months meticulously laying an oval foundation of riverstone, 42 feet at its longest point and 28 feet at its widest. The local ranchers, led by Thomas Macready, whose spread sat 3 miles to the east, gathered at Brennan's trading post each Saturday to share whiskey and ridicule what they called the egg house. To Macready himself, a third-generation frontiersman who had survived 18 Wyoming winters, openly wagered $10 silver that Vogel's peculiar structure would collapse under the first heavy snowfall. Or worse, that the German would freeze to death inside his stone experiment before March arrived. What none of these experienced cattlemen understood was that Vogel had spent 12 years as an apprentice mason in the Black Forest region of Germany, where he had studied ancient round tower designs and observed how curved stone walls in medieval structures retained warmth far more efficiently than their angular counterparts. He had noticed during his first autumn in Wyoming, while helping Macready repair a collapsed corner of his barn, that the rectangular junction of 2 walls created a dead zone where cold air pooled and lingered, while the curved interior of a grain silo remained notably warmer even without insulation. The seed of his unconventional idea took root in that moment, though he knew better than to share his reasoning with men who trusted only what their fathers and grandfathers had built before them. The harsh reality of frontier Wyoming in the 1880s made survival a numbers game that left little room for experimentation. Average winter temperatures in Wind River Valley regularly dropped to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, with extreme cold snaps pushing thermometers down to 40 below. A typical rectangular log cabin, measuring the standard 16 by 20 feet, required approximately 8 cords of split wood to heat through a single winter, assuming the family kept only one room warm and slept together for shared body heat. The chinking between logs, made from mud and moss, invariably cracked and fell out by February, creating drafts that could extinguish candles from across a room. Families woke to find ice formed on the inside of their walls, and children sleeping in loft often suffered frostbite on their extremities, despite being wrapped in every available blanket and buffalo hide. The traditional rectangular design, inherited from Eastern building practices where winters were milder, simply transferred poorly to Wyoming's brutal climate. Yet no one questioned it, because no alternative seemed to exist. Vogel's keen eye noticed something else during that first year on the frontier, when he sheltered from a blizzard in a natural rock formation, a curved alcove in a cliff face. He felt substantially warmer than he ever had in his own rented cabin, despite the alcove having no door and being open to the elements on one side. The curved walls seemed to redirect heat back toward the center, rather than allowing it to escape through corners. He measured the temperature difference with a mercury thermometer he had brought from Germany, finding the curved space was consistently 12 degrees warmer than a similar-sized rectangular space in the same conditions. When he tried to explain his observation to Macready and the others at the trading post, suggesting that an oval structure without corners might trap and retain heat more effectively, they laughed him out of the establishment. "A wall's a wall, Dutchman," Macready had said, using the common frontier slur for Germans. "Don't matter what shape you bend it into. You're just wasting good building time on foolishness." But Vogel had already made his decision. In April of 1883, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig, he began laying the foundation of what would become the most talked-about structure in Wyoming Territory. The first challenge was acquiring suitable stone, and Vogel walked the banks of the Wind River for 6 weeks, selecting and marking exactly 243 large river stones, each weighing between 80 and 120 pounds. He needed stones that were relatively flat on at least 2 sides to ensure stable stacking, and he rejected hundreds of candidates before finding ones that met his exacting standards. Using a borrowed mule and a hand-built sledge, he transported these stones over the course of 3 months, making sometimes 4 trips per day, along a route that varied between 1 and 3 miles, depending on where the best stones were located. His neighbours watched this laborious process with a mixture of pity and amusement. John Brennan, who ran the trading post and whose cabin sat just 2 miles south of Vogel's claim, later admitted he had considered offering to help just to speed up what he assumed would end in failure and abandonment. The foundation took Vogel another 6 weeks to complete, as he dug down 4 feet below the frost line and filled the trench with smaller stones and gravel to prevent heaving during freeze-thaw cycles. The oval shape required mathematical precision to ensure the curve was consistent and true, working from measurements he had calculated and recalculated by candlelight each night. Vogel used a center stake and a rope exactly 21 feet long to mark the outer edge of 1/2 of the oval, then moved the stake 14 feet along the long axis to mark the other half, creating a perfect ellipse. He built the walls themselves using a technique called dry stack masonry, where stones are carefully selected and placed to interlock without mortar, relying instead on friction, gravity, and the precise fit of each stone against its neighbours. This method, common in parts of Europe but virtually unknown on the American frontier, required exceptional skill and patience. Each stone had to be examined, turned, sometimes shaped with a chisel, and test-fitted multiple times before finding its permanent position. The walls rose slowly, mere inches per day, as Vogel worked alone from dawn until dark. By September, with the walls standing 7 feet tall and nearly 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top, the mockery had evolved from casual jokes to active concern trolling. Macready made a show of riding over once a week to inspect progress, shaking his head and offering unsolicited advice. "You know those walls are going to fall right over in the first windstorm, don't you, Dutchman?" he would say, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Stone needs to be built straight up, not leaning in like that. It ain't natural." What Macready didn't understand was that the inward lean, approximately 6 degrees from vertical, was precisely calculated to create what Vogel called a corbelled dome effect, where each stone was supported not just by the one below it, but also by the inward pressure from the stones on either side. Sarah Brennan, John's wife, was more direct in her criticism. "That poor man is going to work himself to death building a tomb," she told the other women at the Sunday gathering at the Methodist Circuit Riders' tent service. "Someone should talk sense into him before winter." The women nodded in agreement, though none volunteered to approach the German, who kept largely to himself and spoke with a thick accent that made communication difficult. Vogel, for his part, never responded to the criticism. He had learned early in his masonry apprenticeship that the best answer to doubt was completed work, not words. He finished the walls in October, then spent 2 weeks constructing a conical roof frame from lodgepole pine timbers that he had cut and peeled himself. arranging 12 beams in a spoke pattern that met at a centre point directly above the middle of the oval floor. He covered this frame with overlapping layers of split shakes, then a layer of sod cut from the meadow, then another layer of shakes, creating a roof that was 7 inches thick at its thinnest point. The entrance faced south, away from prevailing winter winds, and measured just 5 feet tall by 3 feet wide, substantially smaller than the typical frontier cabin door. This too drew criticism, as people assumed he had made a mistake in his measurements, not understanding that a smaller door meant less heat loss every time it opened. The first test came in early November, when temperatures dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, accompanied by a sharp north wind that cut through the valley like a blade. Vogel lit a fire in the central stone hearth he had built, using exactly 1/4 cord of split pine, and measured the interior temperature throughout the night. By midnight, with the outside temperature at 6 degrees, the interior of his oval dwelling maintained a steady 58 degrees Fahrenheit at floor level and 64 degrees at chest height. He recorded these numbers in a leather-bound journal he kept specifically for this purpose, using the same systematic approach he had applied to every aspect of the construction. The next morning, he walked to McCready's ranch to help with a cattle count, a neighborly obligation that frontier custom demanded. Inside McCready's rectangular cabin, he observed the family huddled around a roaring fire that was consuming wood at an alarming rate. McCready's wife, Martha, had wrapped their 3 children in blankets despite being less than 6 feet from the fireplace, and ice crystals glittered on the interior of the north-facing wall. When Vogel mentioned, as casually as he could manage given his limited English, that his own dwelling had maintained nearly 60 degrees overnight with a fraction of the wood, McCready's response was dismissive. "Stone holds cold, Dutchman. Everybody knows that. You'll see come January." But what McCready didn't know, what none of the frontier ranchers knew, despite generations of building experience, was that stone's thermal mass properties worked both ways, and the oval shape was about to prove its worth in a way that would make Vogel's dwelling legendary throughout the territory. The science behind Vogel's design, though he couldn't have articulated it in modern thermodynamic terms, was remarkably sophisticated. Heat moves through 3 primary mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation, and the oval stone dwelling addressed all 3 with elegant efficiency. In a rectangular cabin, heat rises and collects in the corners of the ceiling, where it conducts through the wood and escapes to the outside air. The sharp angles create convection currents that continuously pull warm air up and away from the living space, while cold air sinks and pools in the lower corners, creating zones that remain perpetually frigid no matter how hot the fire burns. The oval design eliminated these dead zones entirely. Without corners, air circulated in a smooth, continuous pattern, rising along the curved walls, flowing across the domed ceiling, and descending back down on the opposite side in a self-sustaining cycle that distributed heat evenly throughout the space. The 2-foot-thick stone walls acted as thermal batteries, absorbing heat from the fire during the day and slowly releasing it back into the interior during the night, a property called thermal mass that modern builders pay premium prices to incorporate into energy-efficient homes. The inward corbelled design created an additional benefit that Vogel had observed in medieval towers, but couldn't fully explain. The shape acted like a reflector, bouncing radiant heat from the fire back down toward the floor, rather than allowing it to escape straight up through the roof. A fire burning in the center of an oval space heats that space approximately 40% more efficiently than an identical fire in a rectangular room of the same volume, a fact that modern physics can now prove with computational fluid dynamics, but that Vogel understood through careful observation and lived experience. The smaller door, criticized by his neighbors as a mistake, reduced heat loss during entry and exit by minimizing the volume of warm air that could escape with each opening, while the thick sod roof provided an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, roughly equivalent to modern insulation rated at R30, compared to the R5 or less of a standard log roof. December arrived with temperatures that old-timers at Brennan's trading post described as a mite cold but nothing unusual, meaning the mercury hovered between 0 and 10 above most days. Vogel continued his systematic measurements, burning exactly 1 cord of wood through the entire month, while maintaining interior temperatures between 55 and 65 degrees, depending on outside conditions and how recently he had fed the fire. He began visiting Macready's ranch more frequently, partly out of genuine neighborly concern and partly to gather comparative data. Macready's family had burned through 4 cords by month's end, and Martha confided to Vogel during one visit that they were becoming concerned about their supply lasting through March. "Thomas says we'll be fine," she said, her breath visible even inside the cabin. "But I've never seen him go through wood this fast." Other families in the valley reported similar consumption rates, and John Brennan noted that he had sold more firewood in December 1883 than in any previous December since he had opened the trading post in 1878. The weather remained cold, but not exceptionally so, and the ranchers settled into the familiar winter routine of daily wood splitting, constant fire tending, and the gradual depletion of carefully accumulated fuel stores. Then, on January 7th, 1884, everything changed. Old Samuel Whitehorse, a Shoshone tracker who traded at Brennan's post and whose grandfather had lived in the Wind River Valley for 7 decades, appeared at the trading post with a warning. He had observed signs that the experienced frontiersman immediately recognized as ominous: unusually aggressive behavior in the wolves who had come down from the high country earlier than normal, the complete absence of birdsong, and a particular quality to the clouds forming over the mountains that he said his grandfather had described as death sky. Whitehorse predicted the worst cold in 60 years would arrive within 3 days and last at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. His predictions were respected because they were based on generations of accumulated knowledge and because he had never been wrong. Families throughout the valley scrambled to split and stack additional firewood, fortify their cabins, and slaughter any livestock they feared might not survive what was coming. The temperature began dropping on the morning of January 10th, falling from 18 degrees at dawn to 0 by noon, a rate of decline that indicated Whitehorse's prediction was accurate. By sunset, the mercury had reached 12 below 0, and a wind from the north began to build, starting as a whisper and growing over the course of hours into a sustained howl that would continue without pause for 11 straight days. Inside his oval dwelling, Vogel added wood to his fire and settled in to wait. But inside Macready's rectangular cabin 3 miles away, the family was already struggling. Macready had split and stacked 8 additional cords after Whitehorse's warning, believing it would be more than sufficient, and he fed log after log into his fireplace in an attempt to drive back the cold that seemed to seep through every crack and gap in the chinked log walls. By midnight of the first night, with outside temperature at 28 below 0 and falling, The interior of Macready's cabin hovered at 34 degrees, despite a fire so large and hot that the stones of the chimney glowed faintly red. Martha had moved the children's bedrolls directly in front of the fireplace, and the family slept sitting up, leaning against each other for warmth, because lying down meant exposing their bodies to the frigid air that pooled along the floor. Inside Vogel's oval dwelling at the same midnight hour, the interior temperature held at 56 degrees. He had burned half a cord since the cold snap began, feeding the fire moderately rather than frantically, and he slept in his normal bed, covered by a single wool blanket, comfortable enough that he woke once during the night, not from cold, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being almost too warm. He added 2 logs to the fire, recorded the temperature and time in his journal, and returned to sleep. The temperature continued to drop over the next 4 days, reaching a low of 42 degrees below zero on the morning of January 14th, a reading that would stand as the coldest temperature ever recorded in Wind River Valley until the winter of 1933. The wind never stopped, driving the wind chill to levels that caused exposed skin to freeze in under 60 seconds and made travel between buildings actively dangerous. Macready's family burned through their 8-cord emergency supply in 6 days, then began burning furniture and anything else that would combust, including fence posts they had stored in the barn and a bookshelf that Martha had brought from her family home in Ohio. The interior temperature of their cabin never rose above freezing during the deepest cold, and ice formed on the walls in crystal sheets that grew thicker each day. Their youngest child, a boy of 4 named Samuel, developed frostbite on 3 toes despite never going outside, the damage occurring while he slept, even though he was wrapped in 2 blankets and wearing wool socks and lying less than 8 feet from a roaring fire. On the morning of January 15th, with their wood supply exhausted and the temperature still at 36 below zero, Macready made a decision that almost certainly saved his family's lives. He wrapped his children in every available blanket, put Martha on the mule, and led them through the howling wind and brutal cold to Vogel's oval dwelling, a journey of 3 miles that took nearly 4 hours and left them all on the verge of hypothermia. Years later, Macready would tell the story of opening Vogel's small door and feeling a wave of warmth wash over him that was so shocking, so utterly unexpected, that he stood frozen in the entrance, unable to speak or move, until Vogel gently pulled him inside and closed the door behind the whole shivering family. The interior of Vogel's dwelling, at the moment Macready's family stumbled through the door, measured 62 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 98 degrees warmer than the outside air, and a stunning 52 degrees warmer than the best temperature Macready had been able to achieve in his own cabin. The German had been burning wood at a leisurely pace, adding a log every few hours, and his supply remained largely untouched. He had a pot of venison stew simmering over the fire, and the air smelled of cooking meat and wood smoke, rather than the desperate, acrid burning of furniture and fence posts. Macready stood in the centre of the oval space, still wrapped in ice-crusted blankets, watching his breath cease to be visible as his body slowly absorbed the ambient warmth, and felt the world view he had inherited from 3 generations of frontiersmen crumble like poorly chinked mud. Vogel, demonstrating both the practical wisdom and the quiet dignity that characterized the best of the frontier builders, said nothing about vindication or superiority. He simply helped Martha settle the children near the fire, offered hot stew to everyone, and told Macready, in his heavily accented English, that they were welcome to stay as long as the cold persisted. The Macready family remained in Vogel's oval dwelling for 8 days, until the temperature finally climbed above zero and they could safely return to their own cabin. During those 8 days, Vogel burned a total of 1 1/4 cords of wood, while maintaining interior temperatures that never dropped below 58 degrees, even during the coldest nights. Macready helped tend the fire, and watched with the focused attention of a man whose certainty has been shattered by undeniable evidence. He observed how the curved walls seemed to embrace and hold the heat rather than fighting it as his rectangular walls had done. He noticed how the air circulated smoothly, without the sharp convection currents that had plagued his cabin. He felt, with his own frost-damaged hands, the warmth radiating from the stone walls even hours after the fire had been allowed to burn down to coals. When they finally returned to their own cabin on January 23rd, Macready found the interior temperature at 19 degrees below zero, ice coating every surface, and their water barrel frozen solid despite being indoors. He stood in the frigid space that had nearly killed his family and made a decision that would alter the architectural landscape of Wind River Valley for the next 3 decades. The adoption of oval stone construction throughout the territory didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the inexorable force of demonstrated survival advantage. Macready, to his credit, was the first convert. He began construction of his own oval dwelling in April of 1884, as soon as the ground thawed, and Vogel spent hours teaching him the principles of stone selection, dry stack technique, and the precise mathematical calculations required to create a true ellipse. By autumn, Macready's oval stone house stood complete, measuring 36 feet by 24 feet, with walls 18 inches thick and a corbelled dome roof. He documented his first winter in the new structure with the same systematic attention to detail that Vogel had modelled, recording wood consumption of just over 2 cords for the entire season, while maintaining interior temperatures averaging 60 degrees. The savings in wood and labour were so dramatic, so impossible to dismiss or explain away, that other ranchers began appearing at Vogel's claim, asking for instruction. John Brennan built an oval dwelling in 1885. Sarah Whitmore, a widow who had struggled alone after her husband died in a logging accident, built one in 1886 with the help of 3 neighbours who worked in exchange for Vogel teaching them the technique. By 1887, 11 oval stone dwellings had been completed within a 30-mile radius of Vogel's original structure, and travellers passing through Wind River Valley began reporting the unusual architectural style to others, spreading the technique to communities in Montana Territory and the Dakotas. Measurements taken over multiple winters confirmed what Vogel had discovered through observation and calculation. An oval stone dwelling of approximately 1,000 square feet required 65 to 75% less firewood than a rectangular log cabin of similar size, while maintaining interior temperatures 15 to 25 degrees higher on average. The original oval dwelling that Heinrich Vogel constructed in 1883 stood intact and inhabited for 47 years, housing 3 different families. After Vogel himself moved to a larger oval structure he built in 1891 when he married a widow named Catherine Brennan, John's sister-in-law, who had arrived from Pennsylvania in 1890. The original structure's walls never cracked or collapsed, despite decades of Wyoming freeze-thaw cycles, a testament to both the quality of Vogel's craftsmanship and the inherent stability of the corbelled oval design. In 1930, the dwelling was finally dismantled, not because it had failed structurally, but because the family living there wanted to build a modern ranch house with electricity and indoor plumbing, luxuries that the territory, now a state for 40 years, could finally support. The stones from Vogel's dwelling were carefully removed and used to build a property boundary wall that still stands today on what is now the Flying V Ranch outside Lander, Wyoming. The oval construction technique became a recognized regional building style, referred to in architectural surveys as Wind River ovals, or simply Vogel houses, in honor of the German stonemason who had proved that traditional knowledge, while valuable, must sometimes yield to observation-based innovation. The technique spread throughout Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas, with over 100 documented oval stone dwellings constructed between 1884 and 1920, when the arrival of railroad-delivered lumber and modern heating systems made such labor-intensive construction economically impractical for most homesteaders. Several of these structures still stand, protected as historical sites, and a few remain inhabited by families who appreciate both the historical significance and the continued thermal efficiency of Vogel's design principles applied over a century ago. The story of Heinrich Vogel's oval stone dwelling represents more than just an interesting footnote in frontier architecture or a clever solution to a thermal management problem, though it is certainly both of those things. It exemplifies a pattern that repeats throughout human history, the pattern of received wisdom being challenged by careful observation, of conventional practice being improved through systematic experimentation, and of a community's initial resistance to innovation being overcome by the undeniable evidence of superior results. Vogel didn't succeed because he was smarter than the third-generation ranchers who mocked him. He succeeded because he had different experiences that led him to ask different questions. Where Macready and the other ranchers saw stone as simply another building material to be used in traditional rectangular forms, Vogel saw stone as a substance with specific thermal properties that could be maximized through shape and thickness. Where the ranchers saw corners as necessary structural elements, Vogel saw them as thermal weak points that could be eliminated. His willingness to endure months of mockery, to work alone when no one would help, and to trust his calculations and observations even when everyone around him insisted he was wrong, turned a harsh Wyoming winter into an opportunity to prove a principle that would save countless families from cold-related suffering over the following decades. The 52 degrees of temperature difference that Martha Macready felt when she stepped through Vogel's door on that January morning in 1884 was the temperature difference between barely surviving and living comfortably, between burning furniture to avoid freezing and sleeping under a single blanket, between children suffering frostbite while indoors and children playing safely in adequate warmth. These stories of frontier ingenuity, of practical problem-solving under extreme conditions, of individuals who observed carefully and thought independently enough to challenge generations of conventional practice, represent a kind of knowledge that modern society is in danger of losing entirely. When Heinrich Vogel laid that first oval stone in the spring of 1883, he wasn't just building a house. He was conducting an experiment in applied thermodynamics using the tools and materials available on the frontier. His success wasn't luck or accident, but the result of careful observation, systematic measurement, and the kind of deep practical wisdom that comes from actually building things with your own hands and then living with the consequences of your design choices. The frontier builders didn't have engineering degrees or computer modeling software, but they had something equally valuable: direct feedback loops where mistakes meant discomfort or death, and successes meant survival and prosperity. That immediate connection between design decisions and lived outcomes produced a quality of thinking, a depth of practical understanding that we would do well to study and respect, even as we benefit from technologies those pioneers could never have imagined. Every time you adjust your thermostat or seal a window against winter cold, you're engaging with the same fundamental questions that Vogel answered with Riverstone and mathematics. How do we create comfortable spaces in hostile climates while minimizing resource consumption? And his answers remain relevant and instructive even in an age of forced air heating and triple-pane windows. If you found this deep dive into frontier thermal engineering and the story of Heinrich Vogel's remarkable oval stone dwelling as fascinating as we did researching and sharing it, then you're exactly the kind of person who would appreciate the hundreds of similar stories we've uncovered about frontier innovation and survival techniques. By subscribing to this channel, liking this video, and leaving a comment about your own family's frontier building stories or techniques you've encountered, you're helping preserve and share knowledge that represents a crucial part of American heritage. The practical wisdom of people who survived and thrived in impossible conditions through careful observation and courageous innovation. These aren't just interesting historical anecdotes. They're a record of how ordinary people solved extraordinary problems with limited resources and unlimited ingenuity. And every subscription helps us continue researching and producing content that keeps these stories alive for future generations who might otherwise never learn that there were alternatives to the standard rectangular cabin, or that a German stonemason in Wyoming Territory once proved an entire valley wrong about the shape of warmth. We've got dozens more stories like this one about water systems and food preservation, about livestock management and tool innovation, all grounded in specific historical events with documented outcomes, and we'd be honored to have you join our community of people who believe that practical frontier wisdom deserves to be remembered and respected. Drop a comment and let us know if your ancestors used any unusual building techniques, or if you've encountered historical structures that made you wonder how and why they were designed the way they were, because those questions often lead to stories as remarkable as Vogel's oval dwelling. Those 23 degrees that separated barely surviving from living comfortably, those 52 degrees that felt like a miracle to a family on the edge of hypothermia, weren't created by magic or luck, but by one man's willingness to trust observation over tradition and to build his proof stone by stone despite the mockery of everyone around him. And that combination of courage and calculation built more than just a warm house in Wind River Valley. It built a legacy of innovation that reminds us that sometimes the wisdom we need doesn't come from following the path everyone else has walked, but from carefully watching the world, asking better questions, and having the determination to build something different even when you have to build it alone.